So good morning, and Jennifer's right. Today, my job is to set the content and really pound you with content for the next 30 to 45 minutes. We're going to give you a broad perspective of some of the drivers of manufacturing competitiveness. And the case I'm going to make is that it's all about talent. Talent and innovation is the key to manufacturing competitiveness. Over the next 45 minutes, we're going to give you a little background as to how we got here, what's the research that we've been doing, what organizations we've been working with. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about whether manufacturing still matters. This is an interesting conference, but if manufacturing doesn't matter, if it's not essential to the economy or economies in general, then we're all kind of wasting our time. So I'm going to make the case for why manufacturing still matters and show you some of the research associated with that. I'm then going to go into what matters the most, and we're going to draw upon input we've received from CEOs around the world, working with a number of organizations, and we're finally going to end, because we're here in the United States, we're going to draw on some research from the United States that we've done with the Manufacturing Institute to understand what the American public thinks about all of this. So first, we're going to give you that background on our research with a number of organizations. With the Manufacturing Institute, we have done a study of the American public. You've got a couple of versions of that. This year's study on the left-hand side, the prior year study behind that, where we go out and we ask 1,000 average Americans every year through a survey tool what they think about manufacturing, how it compares to other industries, what they think matters relative to this, whether they think the country does this well or not, and what they believe are the drivers associated with success in the future. We also go out and talk to executives every several years around the skills gap, and we try to understand what skills, what talent are they searching for, do they have enough of it, where are the deficiencies, if any, and what types of things are they doing to try to close those gaps. Over the last couple of years, I've had the pleasure of working with the World Economic Forum. Last year, we worked with them to develop a report called The Future of Manufacturing, and that was presented in draft form at Davos in 2012. It was officially released to the public in April. And this year, we're working on an extension of that project called Manufacturing for Growth. And that should be released in draft form in Davos this coming January 2013. In fact, a lot of what we're doing here today will be used as input to that research report and that study. And Jennifer and I are collaborating on that based on her role with the Advanced Manufacturing Council and my responsibility for helping lead this project with the World Economic Forum. And then finally, I'm going to be drawing on work we've done with the Council on Competitiveness over a number of years. In 2009, we began a process of looking at manufacturing competitiveness in detail. We thought that that was the next big thing, and the Council agreed with us. So in 2010, we published our first Manufacturing Competitiveness Index. And we did that because frankly, we were unsatisfied with a lot of the other research work that had been done around country competitiveness. It told us things that didn't make sense to our experiences working with multinationals across the world in terms of which countries were most competitive. In fact, it consistently told us things like Switzerland was the #1 most competitive country, China wasn't very competitive at all, and if you live in the world of manufacturing, you don't see that actually happening on a day-in and day-out basis. So we produced our 2010 Global Manufacturing Competitive Index. We have just updated that and released it about 10 days ago. And called it the 2013 Manufacturing Competitiveness Index. I'm going to be bringing you a lot of the input from that today. The Council's also done an excellent job of codifying recommendations to policymakers in a report called MAKE, which you see in the bottom left-hand corner. And then in the Ignite series, we actually went out and got direct face-to-face input from CEOs in Ignite 1.0, from university presidents and national laboratory leaders in Ignite 2.0, and from labor leaders, which we put into Ignite 3.0. So all total, we had close to 80 interviews across 3 different constituent groups on a one-on-one basis for an hour at a time, and we had just tremendous insights into what really drives competitiveness, and in particular manufacturing competitiveness. So what does all this research tell us? That's what we're going to talk about for the next 30 minutes. First of all, does manufacturing still matter? When we began our work for the World Economic Forum on the future of manufacturing, that was not actually a question anybody was asking. It wasn't a question the forum was asking, but we really didn't want to spend the next year doing research on the future of manufacturing if the future didn't really matter. So we said, let's drop back. And as you can imagine, we found opinions, particularly from economists, that were all over the map. From manufacturing doesn't matter, we can be a service economy, to manufacturing matters a little bit. And we finally ended up finding and working with some researchers at Harvard and MIT, the MIT Media Lab, Professors Hausman and Hidalgo. And they have done extensive research using trade export data. And they have trade export data on virtually every nation in the world for the last 60 years. And it is manufacturing export data. And they've developed some very sophisticated models that looks at how countries develop complex economies. And they produced a book late last year that was called The Art of Economic Complexity. In their words, complexity is a good thing. And from an economy perspective, a complex economy is rich, sophisticated, deep networks of knowledge transfer. If you work in manufacturing, we kind of avoid complexity. We try to eliminate complexity from our day in and day out processes, and we don't like complexity. So the terminology doesn't necessarily work, but in reality, complexity is a good thing. And what they concluded, if you look at their models, and what you see on the right-hand side, they've got what they call product space maps. This is actually a node. The colors represent different industry sectors and how those industry sectors interact. And there's a time-lapse sequence. And you can go out and get a time-lapse sequence based on this research now on any country in the world for any time period. In general, what their conclusions were pretty significant. One, manufacturing absolutely matters. In fact, manufacturing and the advancement of manufacturing capabilities is the most important link in terms of understanding what drives the prosperity of a nation. And all nations in the world are advancing their manufacturing capability sets. They're developing more sophisticated products that can be traded on global markets. And as part of that process, they're developing more significant capabilities from the knowledge that they're accumulating. And when they do that, they drive the economic prosperity for their nations. In fact, they've demonstrated clearly that the advancement of manufacturing capabilities, understanding how advanced that capability set is, and whether you can trade those advanced products on open markets is the best determinant to whether or not your country is going to be prosperous or not. They've also indicated that since everybody's doing it, nobody's actually trying to get worse at manufacturing or trying to somehow reduce their innovation capabilities, everybody's getting better, that the competition is getting higher. That advanced nations or developed nations can no longer sit on their laurels. They have to continue to advance their capability sets. And as a result, the competition for high-value jobs will continue to grow. So that's the world we find ourselves in today. These are some other examples. This is Thailand, because Thailand shows some of the greatest progress over the last 30 or 40 years. On the top, which I think is probably more demonstrable of this, we've got what they call the tree maps. And the colors indicate the makeup of the economy for Thailand in 1968, 1988, and 2008. I'll just give you a quick overview, but the lighter colors, the browns, the yellows, the beiges, that all indicates an agricultural economy. As we start to move into the blues and the purples tend to be chemicals, the blues tend to be electronics and advanced machinery, and we can see over a period of time from 1968 to 1988 to 2008 how this economy in Thailand is dramatically advancing its capability sets. And if you were to do this for any country in the world, you would see a very similar pattern, and they compute an economic complexity index. And that economic complexity index continues to increase, and it's also, we put a more common measure that we would understand, which is GDP per capita. We see GDP per capita also increasing. In fact, their research actually shows that every nation, as I said, is doing this with the exception of two. There were only two that really stood out where the economic complexity index was actually decreasing, or it showed some erosion over this period of time, and that was the United States of America and the United Kingdom. And it was consistent with somewhat of an erosion in manufacturing capabilities during that same time period. But if you take all the other 60 nations in the world, they're getting better and better and better at this. So we see whether it's Thailand, whether it's China, whether it's Brazil, you can watch those maps change over a period of time because they're developing advanced manufacturing capabilities, advanced product sets. They're driving innovation, and as a result, they're driving their economies. So let's talk now about what matters most. And we really should look at how do countries and companies compare along these dimensions. So I said that we did work with the Council on Competitiveness for a global manufacturing competitiveness index. In this process, we go out to CEOs around the world, and somehow, which is still an amazement to me, we get them to fill out a very extensive survey asking them to rate dozens of countries on their relative competitiveness, as well as a number of other factors. In 2010, we had over 400 respondents, and what they told us in terms of country drivers, and we computed an index, and we worked with researchers, by the way, from Clemson University and the Indian Institute of Management in Lucknow, along with the council. They told us that talent-driven innovation, a category, is the most important driver of a nation's competitiveness. When they think about where they're going to locate facilities, it's all about the talent and the access to talent that helps them drive their innovation agendas. That was in 2010. In 2013, this is the report we released about 10 days ago, we extended that study and we collected more data. This time we actually got, I don't know how, but we had 550 CEOs or their designates around the world to fill out this study. And we asked them again, virtually the same questionnaire, which countries are most competitive, tell us about the drivers of competitiveness, and also tell us about the policy advantages or disadvantages a nation may have that's either contributing or detracting from competitiveness. So I'm going to take you through that because, interestingly enough, they told us about the same thing. They said that China, they felt, was the most competitive manufacturing nation today, followed by Germany and the United States. What's unique about this study is it's the only study we know of that asks participants to project into the future. It doesn't mean their projections are right, but these are the CEOs that are operating some of the largest companies in the world. There are also some significant number of middle market companies that work in global markets, and they're telling us the same thing, which is 5 years from now, they still believe China is going to be the most competitive manufacturing location in the world. They then say that India and Brazil will jump up to the number 2 and number 3 spots, and both Germany and the US will effectively be pushed down. They will become less competitive relative to those other nations. I've zeroed in on the top 15 because it's kind of hard to see the list of the entire 38 plus countries that we asked them to rate. But when you look at that list 5 years out, a couple of things jump out. 10 of the top 15 countries from a manufacturing competitiveness standpoint will be in Asia. CEOs are telling us that the shift to Asia is undeniable. The Americas continues to be fairly strong, with the United States, Canada, Mexico, and Brazil all in the top 15, but clearly in a different position than the collective strength of Asia. And unfortunately, if you're in Europe, only Germany remains in the top 15 countries over the next 5 years, according to the CEOs responding to this study. But we also asked them about what drives competitiveness. And because, again, this is a little bit of an eye chart we're going to make because we got into a little bit more detail, what they told us again was, 3 years later, talent-driven innovation is still the most important driver of competitiveness for a country. And in addition to these 10 categories, which we arrived at using factor analysis, we have actually 40 individual variables. So if you can imagine this, we had them rank 38 plus countries, we had them rank 40 some variables, somehow they did it, and They told us talent-driven innovation is most important, but inside of that category, they said what's really most important to us is the quality and availability of researchers, scientists, and engineers. That is the first on the list of all 40 variables that go into these 10 categories. Second was the overall quality and availability of the skilled labor force. Ranking 15 on this list of 40 was the quality of primary and secondary schools to produce sufficient student populations proficient in science, technology, and math. Then it was the quality of colleges and universities, and interestingly enough, what was last in that list of 40 was whether or not the country had effective and efficient immigration policies. Doesn't mean it doesn't matter to them, but when they look at their ability to locate and be successful in that nation, they're looking at some of those other drivers as more important on a day in and day out basis to what they do. So clearly it was a reiteration of the fact that talent, innovation, and the ability of that talent to help drive innovation is essential to their success. 93% of the CEOs said that felt that Germany was extremely competitive with respect to talent-driven innovation. 86% felt the United States was extremely competitive regarding talent-driven innovation. And China, 58% of the executives said that it was very competitive in this regard, and that percentage is growing. So kind of to test the limit of how much information we could get out of CEOs, and we did find this was the limit, we then said, well, you know, 3 years ago we said you told us China was the most important, the most competitive country in the world. You also told us talent-driven innovation was the most important driver. Does that mean that China's best at talent-driven innovation? And we didn't ask that question, so we couldn't honestly answer it, right? So this time what we did was we said, well, asking you to rate 38 countries against 40 individual variables, or 38 countries against 10 categories just seemed like a bridge too far for a CEO. In fact, we could, just like Jennifer said she's tracking you here today, we could track them filling out the surveys online. And we know when they got to this question, they stopped. So they said, this is too hard. You're asking me to fill out a matrix that's impossible, at least time-consuming. But we did get them to take 6 countries. We said, okay, we know that these 6 countries ended up in the top 10 last time. We expect they're going to end up in the top 10 this time. Germany, Germany, the United States, and Japan as our models for developed nation economies. And we selected China, Brazil, and India as really models or surrogates for the emerging market economies. And then we asked them to rate those 6 countries relative to the 10 drivers. We knew better than ask them to do it against 40 variables. And in this heat map, the greener the box, the more competitive that particular country is at that particular attribute. And the darker the blue, the lower the competitiveness is of that country in that particular aspect. And we created an index, and we rated all of these individual cells against each other. And what we can see is clearly that the developed nations are competitive because of their ability to drive, well, it's hard to see, but to drive talent and innovation. They rate very highly in that regard. Emerging market economies still rate very highly with regard to costs, and they lag in other areas like the quality of their healthcare system, where you see India coming in the lowest position on this particular matrix. This makes sense to the naked eye. It made more sense than the other studies we had ever seen, and we said, yeah, CEOs seem to have a very good, nuanced understanding of what drives competitiveness. And they can combine different factors to create a competitive situation, but there have to be certain things in place, right? If you have high cost structures, you better be very good at talent and innovation. And if you have low cost structures, you better be good at other things besides just costs. Interestingly, if you look at this, is where China sits. When we arranged the various rows and columns, we did it in this particular sequence because it shows pretty clearly that China is now starting to look a lot more like a developed economy than an emerging market economy. When they rate China, it's coming up on the scale on a number of variables, including talent-driven innovation, and in most of the factors that are there, they start to look very competitive across the board. In the same study, we have an overwhelming amount of additional data. We did not have this in 2010. We knew what the CEOs told us, but we didn't really know whether what they told us made any sense. And we kind of had our thoughts. So we went out and got a lot of macroeconomic data and other data to try to determine, they said this, does it make sense? Does the data support that? And I'm going to take you through a few snapshots of that information here today. First of all, we see, this looks at, along the horizontal axis, we see the real GDP growth of a country, shown by those bubbles, between 2005 and 2010. And on the vertical axis, we see the manufacturing GDP growth during that same time period. The size of the bubble indicates the manufacturing GDP for that nation. And you can see, very similar to what Hausman and Hidalgo was saying, with their much more complicated and extensive analysis, that as manufacturing goes, so goes the nation. And you see almost a direct correlation between the manufacturing growth of a nation and the growth of their overall GDP. And you also see, if you look closely, you see the developing nations moving very quickly in terms of both growth and the size of those bubbles as they transform over time. What that means is that over the next 20, 30, 40 years, there's going to be a tremendous shift in purchasing power parity or consumption around the world. We're sitting here in 2012, which is where that black line is today. At the bottom, that reddish color is China. And we see that certainly over the next decade, between 2012 and 2022, or if you extend it to 2030, you see this dramatic change in consumption, shares of global middle class consumption. So not only are they developing manufacturing capabilities in Asia and accumulating knowledge, that's driving the growth of a new middle class because they're creating higher value jobs, greater wages, and that becomes a self-feeding process that creates more knowledge and more capability sets. And that's not just a guess, that's pretty predictable about what's going to happen over the next 30 or 40 years. So while the United States and North America continue to become significant, you see that it starts to shift dramatically to other parts of the world. What that means is that both the competition for products is going to shift to other parts of the world, and more importantly, the competition for jobs and employment is going to shift to other parts of the world. This is a real eye test, but we went out and grabbed a whole bunch of macroeconomic data on different countries. Those flags represent the top 10 most competitive nations, almost impossible for you to see. So I'm going to zero in with these red lines to say we're going to look at the productivity of the nation, which is that first one I've got circled. We're looking at the researchers and scientists per millions of population. And in the third circled column, we're looking at the innovation index score, and that was something that INSEAD did. And again, very consistent with the CEO's heat map of different nations on different drivers, we see that the actual data says, yes, these nations actually do perform differently on different factors. The United States is the highest in terms of productivity. Productivity is driven by advanced manufacturing processes, capital investment, and a skilled workforce that knows how to use that. That's how they stay at the top of that list. We also see they're fairly high on the innovation index score. We see that the other nations, such as Germany, Japan, also rate above average. The darker blue shows it's above average. The lighter blue is the points below average. And we see the developing nations are moving forward, but they're still really being driven by other things, particularly in the cost areas, but they're moving up. If you would look at this over a period of time, you could see that they're increasing their capability set on these types of scales. We also looked at manufacturing export data. So, because I really want to get as much content into you as possible, because that's what Jennifer said my job was, to get as much content as possible. We're going to pound you. This looks at the export. This looks at manufacturing exports. And along the horizontal axis, we have manufacturing exports compounded annual growth rate. And we've got two different time periods. The lightly colored bubbles, the ones that are a little bit harder to see, that's for the time period 1995 to 2000. And the darker shades, the ones that are more vivid, is between 2006 and 2011, so the most recent 5-year period. On the vertical axis, we've got manufacturing exports as a percentage of overall merchandise exports. And the size of the bubble represents the relative size of that manufacturing GDP, the manufacturing economy. So a lot of things going on this chart. I could build it up over slide by slide, but we're going to do it on one slide and tell you what's happening here. So you can see that most nations have grown their manufacturing economies. They've accelerated their growth rates between the 1995 time period to 2000 versus 2006 to 2011. That's true for China, which you can see. I don't think I have a pointer here, do I? That's true for China in the upper right-hand corner. You can see how small their bubble was back in 2000. By the way, the size of the bubble represents either 2000 or 2011. So the smaller bubble represents 2000 China. 2011 is that larger bubble. So it was growing fast back in 1995 to 2000. It continues to grow even faster. The bubble has grown significantly, but we also see Japan's bubble has grown, Germany's bubble has grown. They've all increased their manufacturing economy significantly from a GDP perspective. It may not represent as much of the economy, right? It may be smaller, meaning it's moved down the vertical axis, but in general it's grown. The slices inside of those bubbles represent whether they're exporting high-tech product, medium-tech product, or low-tech product. And the darker blue is the high-tech product. So you see that China, for example, not only grew the size of its economy, its manufacturing economy, and continue to grow at a very rapid rate, but the dark blue shade grew considerably as well. So some of the exceptions that stand out on that page is the United States. The size of the bubble grew, but not commensurate with every other country on the chart. Canada also has that same type of a problem. They actually went backwards in terms of growth rate. The bubble didn't grow as significantly as competing nations. And maybe more troubling, particularly if you look at the United States, that dark blue shaded component is actually decreased. They're exporting less high-tech product today than they were a decade ago. So we see that the competition for advanced manufacturing exports, which means knowledge, capabilities, higher prosperity, higher value added, is growing considerably. And we see many nations, very consistent with what Hausman and Hidalgo had showed us earlier, advancing their capability sets and using that to drive their economy. If you thought that chart was hard to see, take a look at this one. So we humored ourselves with some additional analysis, and we wanted to look at those 10 most competitive nations, and we wanted to see who their 5 most significant trading partners were, and we wanted to find out what they were trading with them. So we're only looking at the 10 most competitive nations according to what the CEOs told us. We're only showing the 5 their 5 largest trading partners. I think this is busy enough the way it is. And the thickness of the line shows the volume of the trade that they have with that nation. And the color of the line indicates whether it's more high-tech or low-tech. So if it's green, it's the percentage of the export going from that nation to the other nation is more high-tech. It's between 80 and over 80% high-tech product. If it's purple or yellowish in color, that means it's a lower-tech kind of a product. So you can see, for example, China continues to ship a lot of medium-tech or lower-tech product to the United States. India produces and ships out a lot of low-tech product to the United States. Japan is the large high-tech exporter in the world. They're producing and sending a significant amount of high-tech exports around the world. And this not only indicates the trade patterns, but it shows the complication of the trade, the sophistication of the trade, how much trading is going on. Oftentimes, policymakers have a more limited understanding, saying, why can't we make everything in one country and ship it out and do that? But we see that trade patterns are much more significant than that, and trading partners. And the last thing I'll draw your attention to is the amount of high-tech trade that's going on in Asia. You've got a high-tech trade bundle that's going on there between those nations that's reinforcing itself over time. So this, by the way, this report is available both online through the Council's website as well as ours, and you can have hours and hours of fun, I'm sure, looking at these charts going forward. So if talent-driven innovation is most important, we understand who's exporting what to who and how much of that product is high-tech. We also should talk about students and the student scores. These are the PISA rankings in math, science, and reading, the Program for International Student Assessment. This was 2009, which is really kind of the last period we have everything included. And we see that the China, at least as it's represented, Shanghai, China, is at the top of the list in all three of those areas. Reinforcement that would say they're going, if you continue to produce a student population that excels in math, science, and reading, they're going to continue to be able to drive their capability set for advanced manufacturing. We also see the other nations, which correspond fairly closely to some of the 10 most competitive nations or 15 most competitive nations on our list, with the exception of maybe, again, the United States, which ranks relatively kind of off that chart of the top 20, 21st in math, 23rd in science, and 17th in reading. So we see that there is a disconnect at this point in time between the quality of the feedstock, if you will, going into the innovation and system for at least the United States, and the output that we're getting, because we saw the United States was still very high in terms of worker productivity and in terms of innovation index scores. But over some period of time, the question is, do the disconnects between those coming through the system and the output that the country gets, will those change? And on a global basis, we see that, once again, whether it's for manufacturing exports or whether it's for student achievements, it's a very competitive world out there. So then we moved our attention to say, well, let's talk a little bit about research and development and how countries spend money. On the left-hand side, we're showing actually the innovation index score from INSEAD. On the right-hand side, we've got a chart that was developed that shows the researchers and scientists per millions of population, as well as the R&D percent as a percent of GDP. R&D as a percent of GDP is on the horizontal axis. Researchers and scientists per millions population is on the vertical axis. The size of the bubble represents the annual R&D spend by the country. And there's a number associated with each one of the countries on the map, and that's the innovation index score that's coming from that table on the left-hand side. And if you've got another 15 or 20 minutes to stare at this, if you could actually see it, you'd find that, well, interestingly enough, innovation isn't necessarily linked to the amount of money you spend at a country level. There's some correlation, but spending more money, being the largest spender of money, doesn't necessarily get you the highest innovation index score. But there is also a stronger correlation between the number of researchers and scientists you have that drives innovation, right? So innovation is not an exact science. Some money matters. You need to have some of it to drive the equation, but a lot of it doesn't necessarily produce different results. This is at a country level. Then we went and did some research at a company level. And this is some proprietary research we did, and we looked at all sectors in the economy, and we tried to understand whether the highest, or those companies that were rated as the most innovative, right? And we used the global, the 100 most innovative company groups that came from Forbes, and we said, we didn't want to debate how they selected those countries. We just said, we'll use your rating. And we tried to compare how they looked in terms of revenue, net income, and market capitalization versus everybody else. And we saw across all sectors, most innovative companies outperform their peers in all three areas. And when we look at manufacturing, we find it to be true for net income and market capitalization. They lag a little bit in terms of revenue, but they clearly outperform their peers, the most innovative companies. Well, once again, we found that the spend on research and development isn't necessarily the most important driver for a company's capabilities from innovation. So we see that the top 10 most innovative companies, while they outperform on revenue, net income, and market capitalization, they're outperforming those that spend the most on research and development. So the light blue bars are those that spend the most, the top 10 R&D spenders. So you can see there's virtually no correlation between the amount of money you spend and the results you're going to get at a company level. So we want to dig a little bit deeper into the country, or the company competitiveness. And in that same data set that we get from the Council on Competitiveness, we have information from those executives about how they're competing in the marketplace. And we ask them to rank their current competitive capabilities relative to their closest global rival on the horizontal axis, and we ask them to rank the future importance of that capability set, or that asset if in some cases, on the vertical axis. And we drew that diagonal, and it says that if you're above that diagonal, it means that it's becoming more important to you in the future. And if you're below that diagonal, it says that it's probably less important to you in the future. So the further out you are on the horizontal axis, the more competitive you are. The higher up you are on the vertical axis, the more important it is to you. And again, somehow we got those same 550 CEOs to tell us about their competitive capabilities relative to everybody else they compete with. And this is what that looks like. And just because you knew I was going to give you an eye test, you knew there'd be a lot of data points on there. So we asked them to rate a whole bunch of capabilities. And just to make this easier for you, I'm going to draw your attention to this upper left-hand quadrant. And that upper left-hand quadrant, and I've circled a number of these things that have statistically significantly pulled off the diagonal. The things they think they're pretty good at, but are even more important to them in the future, are the productivity of the workforce, the innovation culture of their organization, their research and development capabilities, their product engineering capabilities, the quality of their skilled workforce, and the quality of their human resources. All of those things are the things they're saying we think are very important, in fact, more important in the future than our current capability set provides. And this is for the high-performing companies. So what I didn't really say was we took that entire database of 550 companies and we separated out what we considered to be the high performers based on a number of measures relative to profitability and market capitalization and growth, and we contrasted that with the lower performing companies. And this is just the map for the high performers. So the highest performing companies in the world are saying it's all about talent and innovation, which is interesting because they told us that's the same thing that mattered for a country to be competitive. So they're very, if they're nothing else, they're very consistent. So how do that, if it's all about skills and talent, where are we on skills and talent? Jennifer mentioned earlier that there's a workforce shortage, and this was a survey study we did with the Institute in the United States. And we determined that there were over 600,000 jobs that couldn't be filled today based on a shortage of skills. Manufacturers can't find the right people, whether they're scientists, engineers, or skilled production workers, to fill the open positions they've got. So they're asking the workers they've got to work harder, longer, more hours, or they're simply not taking on the work that they're being given, new contracts. And they say their biggest shortages are in skilled production, engineering technologists, and scientists and design engineers. So consistently they're saying it's all about talent and innovation, both for a country, it's all about talent and innovation for a company. The data says that if I'm more innovative, I'm more successful, and I can't find enough of these people, at least in this country. For the World Economic Forum project, we then took this same type of analysis out to a global basis, and we found that there are over 10 million jobs in the world today that can't be filled from manufacturing organizations, largely in Asia. That 10 million comes from because they don't have enough skills to drive the manufacturing base, the advanced manufacturing base they're hoping to drive. And that problem's only going to get worse over the next 10, 15, 20 years. The population is aging, and a lot of that skilled talent that we have today, in fact, a lot of that talent that's going to be in our panels today, they're going to be retiring. So by 2025 will be the first time in history where those of the over 65 are going to outnumber the young, right? So it gets into some of the intergenerational types of workforces that we're going to have to deal with, but we see this problem progressing at a very rapid rate, that the people that have the knowledge, the skill, the engineering talent, the skilled workers, they're rapidly going to be dropping out of the workforce over the next 15 years. So finally, what does the average American have to say? This is that survey we talked about with 1,000 average Americans that we do with the Manufacturing Institute, and we found that the average American believes that the manufacturing industry is the most important industry relative to any other to drive the national economy. They think it's more important than the energy industry, healthcare, technology, financial services, anything else on the list. We then asked them, if you were able to open up a new facility in your neighborhood, really in your backyard, so to speak, and you could create 1,000 jobs in any industry that you wanted, which industry would that be? And they tell us that the most important industry is manufacturing. We'd rather have 1,000 manufacturing jobs in our community than 1,000 energy jobs, energy production, or anything else. When we then move to industry preference, if you were starting your career today, they didn't tell us manufacturing. They said that We want those 1,000 jobs in our community, but we don't want to do those jobs. In fact, if we were starting our career today, it would be our 5th choice. Unfortunately, the bankers in the retail industry still coming up below that, but they would say that manufacturing is 5th, which is a real disconnect. So we asked them some other questions, and we said, tell us whether you agree or strongly agree with these statements. And they said they believe the U.S. manufacturing industry is high-tech, and it's an industry that has well-educated and highly skilled individuals, that the industry provides careers that are both interesting and rewarding. All of those things are over 50%, right? They also said that jobs in the U.S. manufacturing industry are clean and safe. So it's not that they have a perception that it's dirty, dumb, and dangerous. They think they're high-tech, advanced. They think they require educated people, but they didn't want to use those as their first career choice. What they also told us, though, was that they think manufacturing jobs are the first jobs to be moved to another country. If they're going to lose their jobs, they're concerned about the manufacturing industry because it's been so mobile. And they're not completely sure whether those jobs pay higher, even though the data overwhelmingly says that manufacturing jobs, particularly advanced manufacturing jobs, pay considerably higher than average jobs in the economy. They don't necessarily believe that it's stable, and that they don't really know how to find them, even if they wanted them. So the companies are saying, we can't find these workers. We're missing 600,000 of them in the United States and 10 million in the world. And the workers are saying, we can't figure out how to find them either. So there's a disconnect somewhere in that process. And probably the most sobering news was when we asked them, I'll zero in on this box that said, would you encourage your child to pursue a career in manufacturing? And only 35% of those that were parents said, we would encourage our child to pursue a career in manufacturing. Even though it's the most important industry for the economy, and they believe that it's absolutely essential for us to be successful in it. They said that the school system in their community does not encourage students to pursue a career in manufacturing. And they would say, oh, by the way, my parents didn't encourage me to pursue a career in manufacturing. So what they're saying is that over 65 to 80% of either the school system or themselves are not encouraging the next generation to take on these manufacturing, scientific, advanced jobs that are necessary to drive the economy. We believe that those same 600,000 jobs, if filled, along with another 500,000 jobs that we could create in manufacturing just through a robust recovery in the economy, would translate with a multiplier effect to over 3.8 million jobs. 3.8 million jobs added to the United States at this point in time would drive unemployment down dramatically. So this is a significant economic issue. It's a significant issue for the future of this country, and it's obviously extremely important to other countries around the world as they drive their manufacturing and innovation ecosystems. So with that, I have now pounded you with content, as I promised, for 45 minutes. I believe I've touched on most of the things that you'll be hearing out throughout the day from a talent-driven innovation standpoint, at a country level, at a company level, at an education level, and I expect that the panels throughout the day will help enlighten us as to how we deal with some of these challenges. So thank you very much.
Through a quick stage change here, and our panelists begin to join me up on stage. Then we'll get the water glasses set up and give Craig a break here. Let's give Craig another round of applause, because I have to tell you, we're part of this research, and every time I have the opportunity to listen, I get a little bit smarter. And what I fundamentally know is data matters. It matters to policy leaders. It matters to parents. It matters to kids. Is that job going to be there, and is it going to pay me well? So that's really important. We're now going to move into a discussion, because this is also part of the Institute's approach. Okay, so we got a couple problems. What are we going to do about them? We didn't invite you here just to listen. We invited you here to actively engage and lead when you go back home. So now is the point that we're going to transition into a series of panel discussions. And what you'll recognize is it's going to build throughout today's conversation. If we ground it in research, we're going to start out looking at the innovation equation. What does that actually mean for manufacturing? So I'll let them get set up, and then Craig, turn it back over to you. We will open up to Q&A during the panel discussions. So we have mics that are situated over here. And when Craig calls for Q&A, we'll be able to open it up both to participants here and to our virtual world. We actually have received very positive feedback and have already posted the Deloitte report out there for everyone to gain access to.